All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our third book talk of the semester, The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. I would like to begin by introducing Shannon Davis, who is the Senior Acquisition Editor at Harvard Education Press. Shannon?
Thank you, Mayanne. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Mayanne said, my name is Shannon Davis. I'm the Senior Acquisitions Editor at HEP, and today it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Josh Cowen, who is the author of The Privateers, which we published last month. Dr. Cowen is a nationally recognized expert and writer on topics related to school choice, policy analysis, and education politics. He is a professor of education policy at Michigan State University and has also served as one of 5 national directors of the National Center for Research on Education Access and Choice, REACH, based at Tulane University. In 2016, he founded the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative, EPIC, a strategic research partnership between Michigan State University and the state of Michigan. In addition to his academic writing, his work has appeared in major media outlets such as Slate and Time magazine. The Privateers is Dr. Cowen's first book. Josh, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Paul for being here, and looking forward to chatting today.
Of course. It is also my distinct honor to introduce you to our moderator for today's book talk. Please welcome Paul Reville, who is the Francis Keppel Professor of Practice of Educational Policy and Administration here at HGSE. Dr. Reville is also a nationally recognized policy expert and researcher who served as the Massachusetts Secretary of Education from 2008 to 2013 under Governor Deval Patrick. He is the founding director of HGSE's Ed Redesign Lab and the co-author of 2 Harvard Education Press books, Collaborative Action for Equity and Opportunity with Lynn Sachs and Broader, Bolder, Better with Elaine Weiss. Dr. Reville, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Gutman Library, for hosting this book talk. So we'll listen to your conversation and then reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A from our viewers. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Josh and Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. A pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank all of you in the audience for coming out. And our plan is to have an interesting conversation with you. Josh and I will be talking for about a half an hour or so, and then we're going to open it up to questions for you. Josh, a pleasure to meet you and to have the opportunity to talk with you about this. I thought we'd start off by just saying here, your book is a sort of compelling and provocative book. It documents the origins and history of school voucher programs in the U.S. and raises some serious questions about how vouchers in general have been sold to the American public. So I wonder if you'd take a few minutes just to set the stage before we get started and talk about, sort of summarize what you are trying to accomplish with the book and themes that you think are most important that arise from your writing.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and thanks again to our hosts and to Shannon for the introduction. So, the first sentence of the book is I didn't want to write this book, and what I mean by that is, I am a policy analyst by training, political scientist originally, sort of working in the space of American politics, but a policy analyst by training, and including in areas related to school choice, but also more generally on issues all over sort of the education policy spectrum. And the sort of most recent chunk of my career before, say, 2022 or so, was really devoted to, what folks understand in our world as the evidence movement in education, to sort of trying to use data and evidence to inform public policy. And, by those standards, by that kind of background, through that background, vouchers had really kind of died from an empirical standpoint around 2018, 2019 or so. And it was well understood in the research community that vouchers, especially the bigger and the more recent voucher systems, had not only failed to produce results for kids and families, but had done so in a pretty remarkable, almost unprecedented way for a public program. And yet, they have been more recently thriving again as sort of a policy spread phenomenon, mostly in red states, but out there in the world. As I say in the book, I had kind of moved on professionally from this issue area, and I believe the field had. And it wasn't really until the beginning of 2022 when I got a call early in 2022 from NBC News asking me to comment on a new voucher system that was being proposed in Michigan, in my state, by organizations associated with Betsy DeVos. And my first reaction was sort of, why are we even having this conversation? Even this research center that Shannon mentioned that I remained part of the board of directors on, at that time, we really weren't working. This was R&D Center for the U.S. Department of Ed. We weren't really working on voucher questions. It was charter schools. It was open enrollment. It was parent preferences in general, but it really wasn't vouchers. And that was reflecting the evidence base at the time when we started that project. So what the book set out to do is answer this question. Okay, if vouchers have shown some of the worst results on record on any research question, the history of education research, which they have, isn't really debatable. Why are we in this moment? And the answer that I kind of come to is, why are we talking about book bans? Why is Trump researching again? And why are we talking about where kids go to the bathroom in public schools? It is part of a larger political moment that we're in, and vouchers are just one of those political sort of reflections of that moment.
Okay. Well, I wonder if you'd talk a little bit, Josh, about, you described what you characterize as a widespread national movement.
Yeah.
And other phenomena or related phenomenon we see on the scenes in some of these states who are instituting the kinds of policies you described that as broadly speaking, vouchers. How you situate vouchers by comparison with education savings accounts, tax credit scholarships, and policy instruments like those?
So I define vouchers as meeting two criteria. Do they pay for private K-12 tuition? And do you have to leave public schools to be eligible for those dollars? And by those two definitions, all of those policy vehicles you just described, tax credits, education savings accounts, whatever, are vouchers. The education savings account framework in particular is simply vouchers plus. So it does vary by state. You have states like Arizona and Florida where it can be spent on a wide variety of expenses associated with education, including homeschool expenses. The second biggest vendor for Amazon at the moment is Amazon. But the first biggest vendor remains private school tuition. And so I think we can kind of get a little bit lost in the details here. You have Iowa, you have Arkansas, are called education savings accounts. But in Iowa's case, for example, it literally sits in something like an escrow account before it's sent to the private school to pay for tuition. And those extra expenses really are just uniforms, textbooks, things associated with private school tuition. The key piece here, though, again, in addition to the private school tuition piece, is do you have to be eligible? Do you have to leave public schools to be eligible for these plans? And if so, they really have a lot more in common in any meaningful way with vouchers than any other policy initiative. And this was a point I made very forcefully in a Brookings column about a year ago, this point. Like, the evidence is there's nothing in the policy design of those other tax credits, ESAs, that would make you think the theory of action that led to pretty horrible empirical evidence on the voucher piece classically should differ anymore, just because parents can spend dollars not just on tuition, but on big screen TVs and call it homeschool expense.
I wonder if you comment on the sort of value proposition with respect to public education and how you think about public education. What makes education public in the first place? And how do we distinguish, if we should at all, between the public value of public education, that is the benefits that derive to the general public, versus the private value of education, about which much of the choice and voucher movement seems to focus on? How you distinguish between those and where you think we ought to be putting our attention as a nation?
Well, it's a great question. I almost have to write that down for like a qualifying exam question or something. Listen, my view on the public education piece itself is still evolving, in the sense that public schools reflect the social context they're in. So to the extent public schools have at times come up short on issues of racial justice, on issues of income equality, on issues of geographic access to meaningful quality, I think that substantial more work needs to be done. But at the end of the day, 90% of students still go to public schools. They're not going anywhere, at least in the short term. And that means that most of the things that we sort of socially and economically believe to be of value have to in some way begin, at least from the standpoint of both sort of molding citizenship, but also economic development, have to begin in some way with thinking about public education space. The problem with the theory of action for vouchers and sort of the ideology there, my view is it's based on one of isolation, one of separation, one of exclusion, is sort of quite literally kind of giving folks a coupon and having folks kind of fend for themselves in a community environment or in an economy. And I don't think that reflects really the way that the country works, the economy works, the policymaking process works. It isn't enough to simply say you can all separate and isolate from each other. We live in a global world. We live in a world where you interact with your community, you interact with people who have different religious values from you, who may have different policy preferences from you. We have to figure out a way to get along with each other and to make decisions in a democratic framework. If whatever else they are, vouchers don't embrace that idea. It's much more everybody's going to kind of carve out their own space and resolve differences by avoiding each other. And I decline to accept that that's a productive and even a moral framework for living in a democracy.
Yeah. So what you're describing is that you see vouchers leading to a kind of balkanization by ethnicity, race, religion, geography, whatever it might be, and a movement toward thinking of education as solely having personal value, individual value, as opposed to an element of preparing young people collectively to be part of a common nation, a common society, and so on and so forth. And that's exactly the balance that we're trying to strike.
That's right.
I wonder, thinking about it from the standpoint of taxpayers, I used to have to do this when I was Secretary of Education, and we had the charter school movement, which is not the same thing as the vouchers.
At all.
Let's be clear about that.
At all.
But people used to say, well, your job as Secretary of Education, if I go to a public gathering occasionally where charter schools were in controversy, they'd say, your job is to protect our system of public education. And this charter school movement is undermining it. And I would say, no, my job is really to ensure that taxpayers get the best possible value, public value, for the money that they spend on public education. It's not to defend a particular delivery system, but it is to defend a system, a fair system, underlined fair, that has a lot of requirements to it, a fair system where taxpayers get the best possible educational return for the amount of money they spend.
Yeah.
A certain amount of that rationale is part of the rationale that folks give for vouchers. And I wonder if you'd react to that a little bit.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I have said in other public commentary, it is very important, as you just said, to remove charter schools from some of the specific conversation, both from the standpoint of just what the policy actually entails, but also from an evidence base. The charter school evidence base there's nothing like the negative declines in the charter school side. There aren't, folks can characterize the positive results of charter schools, perhaps maybe a little differently than I might, but we can all agree there's not just this kind of catastrophic learning loss associated with charter schools that there have been over the last decade with vouchers. So that would lead me to sort of the second part of my answer, which is, it isn't as if we don't have good data on what has happened up to the start of the pandemic with voucher systems. I mean, it's very simple. The bigger and the more recent the voucher system, the worse the results have been. And there's some reasons for that, and kind of get into a little bit of the book, but the bottom line is the idea failed at scale. And with that, as such, it has a lot in common with many other educational interventions that kind of have went by the wayside over the years. The difference is there isn't a big sort of conservative movement or a movement of any sort behind some of those other initiatives, like there is with vouchers, to sort of blow through that evidence base. So if the value proposition is simply our taxpayers getting what they're paying for, and then we have to talk about what the data actually show, then overwhelmingly, vouchers are not the solution to all of the very real problems that do face public schools. If it's just on anything resembling a common metric, vouchers have really kind of failed. And I think that's where we kind of have to really confront the possibility that like this thing just isn't working. Sometimes it's that simple. It didn't work. It's bad theory. The results aren't good. And so we need to kind of move on if the question is about our taxpayers getting bang for the buck.
Fair enough. So you mentioned COVID, and we obviously know in a lot of these locations around the country, there's been, in most of the country, there's been profound learning loss and deep deficits that have developed and need to be remedied. One could argue that in the case of Louisiana, for example, there was something comparable in impact to COVID with the hurricane that devastated that community. And it didn't have a terrific school system to begin with. I mean, it was a failing school system to begin with. I wonder if, how confident you are about the pre-COVID evidence in places like Louisiana, in Washington, D.C., in Indiana, which you talk about. Are you confident that the results and these are places with high concentrated poverty and places with historically with school systems that had not been serving the populations well, and yet nonetheless your assertion is the data will show that injecting vouchers onto the scene didn't make a positive difference. In fact, it was even worse than it had been before.
I mean, one of the things that I talk to when reporters ask me versions of this question, they're sort of, well, but Ed Choice or some of these organizations say parents are happy or so on and so forth. At the end of the day, you can get dizzy shifting the goalposts and shifting the ground for different metrics here. If we're going to use test scores to document COVID era learning loss or public school failures or achievement gaps or whatever you want to call them, then the first question we should be asking about vouchers is how do the results look on test scores? If we're not going to use academic outcomes or metrics, standardized tests, whatever, to ask about public school results, then maybe we can open that conversation up to how vouchers are doing on other metrics. But the coin of the realm, you were a state chief. Say what we want about test scores, they still are the coin of the realm for public school accountability. And so anytime the conversation is public schools have fallen flat due to COVID, the unions kept them closed too long during COVID. You hear this out there in the rhetoric. They point to test score based evidence for that. And at the end of the day, like we don't get very many. I think sometimes folks who don't come out of the social science community, many really well-skilled reporters don't. They kind of assume that researchers have 100% certainty on every measure that they ever kind of go out there and publish a paper on. By any standard of social science, the fact that there is a direct correlation between the size of the voucher system and its recency would strongly suggest, by any measure we have, that these things are bad news for kids and families. Does that mean that all of the evidence is stacked against vouchers? No, but it does mean that on the evidence that we have, and the most high quality and the most recent and the biggest programs, these things failed to scale. 70% of voucher users were already in private school to begin with. And that's been true both from the first academic study to look at this question in 2007. So what is that, 17 years ago? And that's been true more recently as state departments of ed have been churning these reports out on who uses these things. Tuition prices are going up as a result of vouchers. I don't know, and I think it is an open question, how vouchers might perform with well-off families, high-income families, families who were already in private school to begin with, are they happier to have the tax rebate for tuition they were paying before? Probably. Are they doing okay in elite private schools that no one argues no one argues exists, and maybe in some of the best schools in the world? No, I don't think anyone's arguing that. But the question is, when you're talking about historically marginalized communities, communities who are at risk, communities who have been let down by the public school system, the evidence is quite strong at this point. I've called in other settings vouchers as sort of the education equivalent of predatory lending. And what I mean by that is the evidence is quite strong that lowest income families, families of color, historically marginalized populations have really been poorly served by these voucher schemes in the past. I think we have got really good data on that at this point.
Americans love choice in most walks of life, whether it's in the grocery store or with healthcare or where they choose to locate and live and what kind of house they buy and so forth. So, yeah, part of the argument that goes along with the movement toward school choice is that why not give them more choice in terms of education? And this comes up against the public value and private value question that we raised earlier. You describe in this work a strong sort of religious component to the movement in this direction, what you've in some places called a vast right-wing conspiracy. So this is not necessarily a positive thing. So I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about that. Who are the villains leading this and this movement? And contrast it, if you will, because it's been my experience that there are a lot of people in the choice movement. I recognize that conspiracy you talk about, by the way. I don't at all deny that that's there and that's potent. But at the same time, I know many advocates in our part of the country who've been in favor of choice and in some cases vouchers for a long time with no kind of affiliation whatsoever with that movement, but just had felt like, a free market Milton Friedman kind of system is the best way to get high quality schools and school improvement.
Yeah, so great question. So if you're just looking at public statements, right? So folks like Betsy DeVos have said that school vouchers, the goal there is to advance God's kingdom. Her 501c4, the American Federation for Children, has a separate sort of a tied campaign to voucher advocacy, basically based on saving Catholic schools from closure. And then the idea is supporting vouchers will add enrollment to Catholic schools and forestall financially distressed closures. It is those financially distressed schools, by the way, that make up the vast majority of openings for voucher kids that do transfer from public to private school, the ones that are not already in private school, the transfers. So there is a very explicit religious component to this piece, and both from sort of what some of these advocates say, and then also just kind of where else we are in this country right now. But
which is not the same thing as saying everybody who supports vouchers necessarily has religious motivation.
No, but that's where a lot of the energy is, right? And so and the money. And this is not me saying, I mean, the New York Times just did a big piece with ProPublica on some of the two Texas pastors who happen to also be oil and gas billionaires pushing vouchers in that state, aligned with the DeVos organizations. This is, I have called in other spaces vouchers the new American religious separatism. I mean, it really is. There's a lot of energy around just carving out spaces for kids to leave the public space and go into these church-based schools. There's a group called the Herzog Foundation based in Missouri, is a big sort of regional player in the space that sees school choice as a mission field, in their words. That means those who, with a religious background, is just like, this is an objective to raise young Christians, and vouchers will help. That's the policy tool to raise young Christians, at least from a funding perspective. But it's true that there are many choice advocates that don't embrace that logic. I would say the other set of groups, and I talk about this in the book to some extent, are kind of that more Friedman-esque, libertarian, market-oriented folks. Again, we have ample evidence on the terms available to us as social scientists that, at least when it comes to historically marginalized families, that the Friedman idea didn't work and in fact failed catastrophically. But just taking on face value the argument there, there is this general sense that, less government, fewer regulations, less oversight, let the free market play itself out. Two comments on that. One, just remember when it comes to vouchers, in a way that even more so than with charters or magnet schools in the public domain, when it comes to vouchers, it really isn't the parents doing the choosing. It isn't the market working for parents. The schools are doing the choosing. They get to deny whoever they want. And that is something new that was not existent in the early voucher legislation, say 15 to 20 years ago when I first started on this. But the second thing here is a lot of this comes down to policy specifics. So the through line between the kind of Christian nationalism of a DeVos type organization and the free market, Friedman style, libertarian style in education industry of say a Charles Koch is deep hostility to labor unions. And I think we have to be really clear about some of that too, that what trying to connect some of this in is if show me someone who wants to radically decentralize publicly funded education in this country, and I'll show you somebody who generally has some deep skepticism about a healthy role for teachers unions in publicly funded education.
I wonder if you comment on the role of one of our Harvard colleagues, Paul Peterson, in this movement. You have described his work in research and how that's contributed to the movement. I wonder if you talk a little bit about that.
Well, what's important to know about that body of work, and I was part of some of it earlier in my career, is that it has always been part of sort of the advocacy process. And I don't just mean kind of yay or nay. And a lot of us, I mean, I'm certainly an opponent of these things in an advocacy way, but I mean in an advocacy way, both from the standpoint of creating legislation and eventually creating and supporting litigation. So a lot of this work sort of originated at political moments where legislation was about to be defended or passed, and then, as I say in the book, the run up to Zellman versus Harris, the Supreme Court ruling in 2002 that ultimately blessed vouchers, as it were, for the first time. That doesn't mean that every single paper or report that came out of that research team is problematic, and I don't say that. I say that very clear that that's not the position I take in the book. But it is important to know that the difference between kind of creating knowledge for knowledge's sake, creating a sort of an evidence base for social science, and creating work that's specifically targeted to legislation and litigation has a very different purpose. And what that means is there's going to be it's not the result of kind of a groundswell of either voters and parents on the advocacy side or researchers kind of trying to clamor to create knowledge on a certain space. What it does mean is that the evidence base for vouchers is still, to this day, incredibly narrowly tailored. About 60% or so of all positive voucher studies come from either Dr. Peterson himself, two of his graduate students, or their graduate students. It's an incredibly narrow base. And for folks trying to understand what that means, that just means that a literature such as it is does not exist without the voucher advocacy community. And again, does that mean that there's a problem with any individual study? No, but what it does mean is that we need to be really, really careful evaluating strong claims on behalf of these systems, because the preponderance of the evidence generated from other fields really would raise enormous caution.
I wonder, when I teach units on school choice and touch on vouchers, I always say to my students, the devil's in the details in terms of how you put together a program. I wonder if you think it's even theoretically possible that one could have, as a matter of public policy, a fair, equitable system of school choice that featured vouchers that wouldn't lead to some of the excesses or inequities that you described, for example, in admissions, or the sort of balkanization, or the lack of accountability for results and things of that nature. Is that conceivable, or should we just put vouchers in the rearview mirror and start to focus on greater funding for public schools?
Well, I think the second part I do want to talk about, as the evidence against vouchers has accumulated over the last decade, we've gotten a lot more clarity empirically on the strong positive results for funding public schools in different ways. So I do want to touch on that, but to sort of address your first question, you laid out what the hallmarks of what I would say would be required. And I actually released a report relatively recently, a couple weeks ago now, from the University of Colorado, but sort of laying out. And I take the position at this point empirically, there isn't really any such thing as a good voucher bill, but there are, listen, tens of thousands of children learn or are in voucher funded spaces every day. I don't believe that every one of these children are always being poorly served. And I don't believe that states with voucher systems today are going to just abandon them one day, which means we have to talk about how to make these things better. You mentioned working in a charter school environment. One of your counterparts in Michigan once made the statement about charter schools in our state: 150,000 publicly funded kids. Those are our public school kids too. Voucher kids are being served by private schools today, but they're being funded by taxpayers. And so in some sense, we do need to have a conversation and not consider those folks lost to policymakers or lost to people who care about children. I do think transparency, accountability, oversight, financial oversight included, not just, understand, is the school ready to take on new seats for kids? Are they able to work with marginalized populations? The Louisiana results were flagged by voucher advocates when they came out as being the explanation for why the voucher results were there is it was over-regulation, is the phrase, sort of the bugaboo of conservative policy. It's too much government regulation. But what they meant by that was, above all, that schools had to have open admissions if they accepted voucher payments, and they had to use the state exam.
Mhm.
And and so that did lead to some of the higher quality schools saying no thanks. But the implication from that, walking that explanation forward, is that once free to discriminate, these private schools wouldn't discriminate. They once not required to accept all comers, those schools would on their own decide to accept all comers. There's not a lot of coherence with the explanation, and particularly given that, and this is something that I cite a lot of studies in the book, but one study that I was particularly involved in myself, we have strong evidence from Wisconsin that 4 years of no changes, as sort of no growth for private or public school students in the years we were tracking those students. But then when the state required those voucher funded schools to basically follow No Child Left Behind, they had to do the same things the public schools were doing at the same time in terms of testing, accountability, and so on. The voucher results actually improved dramatically. So once schools knew they were going to have their own school name associated with the average school results, and it wasn't just going to be a public-private voucher public comparison, but schools knew, St. Anselm on the hook for its results, St. Mary on the hook for its results did improve. So I would start with any forward-looking conversation about voucher policy making around those key issues: transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, and to some extent some financial oversight.
So it is conceivable that you could put those kinds of policy requirements on the schools and conceivably have a voucher program that could be equitable and not have the sorts of inequitable excesses that you describe in your book.
In what other policy realm would we, there's partnerships with, whether community-based partnerships or state-based partnerships with private providers for a social service, happens all the time. It's not just in education.
Right.
But in what other realm would we just give the vendor, as it were, a cash payment or a set of cash payments and say, we're not going to check on you, especially if you're serving at-risk children. We're not going to check on you. We wouldn't do that in any other policy realm. And yet, for some reason, we've moved to the voucher conversation to such that the other side is arguing we should do that. Just give everybody a check and walk away without looking. And I don't think that's a realistic view of public policy in any setting, education or anything else, but particularly policy when it comes to at-risk kids.
And by the way, we have a responsibility to the taxpayer to see that their
Yeah.
money is being well spent on whatever education services we're purchasing with it. So I think that's important. Well, speaking of money, you've made a case. I mean, a lot of people have disagreed historically or raised questions about whether or not there's truly a production function in economic terms
Right.
of education. That is to say, the more money you give, the better results you give. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting there isn't a straight production function, that within certain boundaries, yes, money matters, but really it's all about how you spend the money. You comment on this in your book, and I wonder if you'd tell us more about your thinking on it.
I think in broad terms, that's the right way to characterize the research on school spending. Money does matter, and of course, how you spend it does matter. But if you look at the kind of cleanest evidence on this, that's certainly true on the margins. But we, in no empirical case recently, is it true that that spending more money just has absolutely no benefits. And so then the question just becomes, how big are those benefits? And then the question is, how large those benefits and on what metrics and on what outcomes does partly depend on what you're spending the money on. Say capital improvements will improve certain types of outcomes, but not others, that kind of thing. But just this general question, if you listen to kind of sort of the conservative policy makers on this, it's a fairly fringe position at this point in policy analysis that the idea that money doesn't matter at all. There's only a handful of people, they happen to also be pushing vouchers, that would tell you today that more money isn't absolutely necessary for improving outcomes. And the thing that's important here, and I say this in the book, but it's also true in the literature, it isn't just on academics. It isn't just on test scores anymore. We're getting strong evidence on other outcomes. For example, increases in wages later in life for investments made 20 years earlier in local school districts, reductions in crime rates in districts and communities that were invested in 20 years earlier. A new paper out by university researchers at Brown University, Ann Arbor, life expectancy going up in districts that were invested in 20, 30 years earlier. There's a pretty, like, we don't get, again, as much as the negative impact of vouchers over the last 10 years, we don't get a lot of straightforward answers in the policy research community like this. And I think sometimes the skepticism that we still have on this question of money and investments is partly due to bad data 30, 40 years ago, but also a lot of effort made on the other side of this to say that you're just throwing money at a problem, when in fact, it's pretty careful careful evidence that suggests that in fact these things investments do matter. And then on the flip side, for example, good evidence coming out of the Great Recession that de-investments, cuts, or flatlining public school spending do have adverse effects on kids. So I think we should have arguments about where to spend these dollars, but we have to begin with the proposition that we're going to be spending more money in the first place and not slowing it down, and then we can have those conversations about how exactly to spend those dollars in a productive way.
Fair enough. And I think we'll have a new opportunity to study this question as a result of the ESSER and ARPA funds that came in during the COVID time, which were enormous increases in expenditures in districts. And
yes,
it's yet to be seen what the results of those investments were and how it might have made circumstances different from what would have happened had those monies not been there. So that'll be an interesting question.
It's a good framing of it. Yeah.
I'm curious, as you think about the book that you've written, why you wrote it in the first place, and what you're hoping that readers will take away from your book. I mean, what's to do on this? What kind of you're increasing awareness? You have concerns that you want to share about the evidence and about this movement on the right wing to privatize the system of education. What should readers be thinking about doing about all this?
Well, when I started to write the book, it was really about the evidence case. And even the first chapter tries to just lay out what I think is sort of a reasonable reading of the evidence on 7 or 8 propositions, not just on test scores, but just who gets accepted, who gets which choice of school, what happens to tuition rates, when vouchers come to town. But as I went through it, and then also just kind of as I've developed, frankly, something of a public voice in this space, beyond just the book, and book is certainly part of it as a launching pad, but we are in this moment in American politics, and we are in this moment culturally, where really hard questions about what it means to be an American, what it means to be a man or a woman, frankly, what it means to be responsible for both our own children, and then what commitment do we have to other people's children? Is it a commitment to their well-being, or are we going to simply make policy against other people's children, which I would claim the right wing in this country is trying to do right now? uh, the voucher piece, vouchers are two of the first three paragraphs in this document called Project 2025. They are in the second sentence of Donald Trump's education policy platform called Trump 47. So they are a very important part of today's political conversation, regardless of whether I wanted to write my book or not. I just happened to write it in a moment where this was all ramping up. But for me, what I think the take-home point here is, say you aren't into what social science has to say about vouchers. Say you take the position that more vouchers and more school choice in general are the outcomes that we should be pushing for, regardless of how they affect kids' academics or kids' graduation or whatever. It's just more choice is better, which is some way of thinking about what the other side might say on this. It doesn't really matter. Parents should just get these vouchers and we should all just walk away. Then I would just simply say this. At some point, it becomes a question of what we think is the right and the wrong way to go about making improvements in the lives of people that we live around. And what is the point of public policy if not to first and foremost do what can be collectively done to improve lives, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Improve lives for the people that we live around. That means often that's a question of dollars and how to use taxpayer dollars, but sometimes it's also a question of just who is considered part of a community. And one of the things that I object to, and I've said this many times, is that, if you move away from that evidence base, that framework that I sort of have tried to lay out in this conversation, I try to lay out in the book, then you really do have to walk into a debate about morals and a debate about ethics and a debate about values. And I'm not sure that that's a position that all anti-voucher folks have wanted to get into. But I am trying to say, for folks who do believe that public schools are central to democracy, who do believe that democracy is actually a form of government worth having itself, who do believe that the results of elections should hold, who do believe that we have shared commitments to vulnerable communities, who do believe that using public policy to bully certain children because of what they look like, because of their parents' marital status, because of how the child might wish to be called, or the teenager might wish to be called, what their name is, what their gender identity is. I think that making public policy to marginalize those communities is simply wrong. And I believe that you have to be naive to not see that the voucher pushes part of this larger moment to try to do so. And my hope is that I am helping to contribute not just the language of policy analysis, but the language of debate about what's right and wrong in American democracy, in American education. And I would start with trying to make sure that our most vulnerable kids and families are taken care of. And that's kind of what I hope people get from this effort.
Okay, I'm going to ask members of the audience to start thinking about questions. Shannon's going to bring forward questions. I'll give you a moment to think about it and ask Josh one last question. So if you had a group of policymakers in a state legislature who are thinking about this and are being challenged by various advocates to come forward with voucher programs at the moment, or educational savings accounts or scholarship programs, what would your advice be to them as a legislature from a policy standpoint?
I would say if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And if we're going to ask expert opinion and you're going to weigh the results of policy analysis at all, then you should be very, very, very cautious about investing in these programs. They do cost money. They increasingly cost money, and you will have to pay the bill. There's no such thing as a free lunch. You will have to pay the bill for these programs. Strong data suggests that it's not worth it. But if you do go ahead and do it, then you need to be able to explain why these voucher schemes are growing and growing and growing with more and more dollars. You can't take that vote back once it happens, and that's what I would suggest.
Okay, thank you. Shannon, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet. So viewers, please feel free to use the Q&A function if you have any questions. Oh, one just came in. So how would your book be useful to parents who would like education choices?
That's a great question. What I would say is if you are using a voucher to look at different school opportunities, or you are even sort of sorting between looking at charter schools or interdistrict, I would to the extent you're able, I would inquire from that school along the lines that you think is best for your kid and for what you want that child's education to be like. And I would be very skeptical of a school that promises you things that they're not willing to show you. So if they tell you that the academic results at their private school are going to be better for your child than public school, and they're not using an exam or they're not using the state exam, be very skeptical. If they tell you that we don't worry, we will address your child's special learning need, but don't put us on the hook for an IEP or a 504. We don't do that. Just trust us. I would be very skeptical. If the schools are really kind of, again, the promises are being made in ways that can't be compared and contrasted. I've always said that private school accountability, particularly within the choice framework, is a pro-parent policy. Asking schools, none of us would, for example, buy a used car off a lot without a test drive, much less buy a used car without a test drive where we strapped our child into a car seat in that used car without a test drive. The problem is you can't do that in shopping for schools. You have to kind of, to some extent, get the data up front or get the facts up front. And I would be extremely skeptical of a voucher school that asks you to take a leap of faith, as it were, and trust them without them showing some documentation behind what they have to say.
Great. Another one has come in. So how do vouchers compare to charter schools, and are both similar?
So charter schools are more or less publicly funded, but independent private schools. Independent public schools. They're independently run. The other side on this question, the pro voucher folks in particular, want to just call everything school choice and not make a distinction between charters and vouchers. That's just, it's not only not correct. Charters are not the same thing. They are public schools that are independently run. But talking about the evidence, there are some studies, and some of them very high quality and recent, that show that charter schools in certain environments, particularly with real oversight, have made meaningful improvements in kids' academic outcomes and in their chances for college enrollment and success. Those studies more or less do not exist in the voucher literature, at least since 2013. You have to go all the way back to 2012 to get the last high quality voucher study to show that kids' academic outcomes improved, and you have to go all the way back to 2013 to show vouchers improved graduation or high school attainment rates. There's been much more favorable results for charters, and conversely, nothing like. There have been a handful of studies showing slight negative declines for voucher charter school academics, but there's nothing like the huge loss academically for vouchers that you see. There's nothing like that in the charter school research literature. So I've said this before, and I'll say it again. An evidence-based approach to school choice policymaking would start with charters well before they brought vouchers into the mix.
If I could jump in, Shannon, just here, because this relates to our prior conversation about policy tools that one could use to frame the environment in which vouchers happen, or as in the case of charter schools, not all charter schools are alike. Not all state regulations with respect to charter schools are alike. In fact, they're all different. And so you can, as you alluded to, Josh, look in different environments around the country. We happen to have a very strong regulatory framework here in Massachusetts, so oversight and conditions that control for factors like open and fair admissions, rigorous accountability, testing for all students, open meeting laws, things of this nature. And as you pointed out, charter schools have thrived in that sort of a regulatory environment.
That's right.
Might, by extension, think that, okay, if you could do that in the voucher world, maybe you could have an experiment that worked. At the same time, it would probably radically reduce the number of schools that wanted to take a voucher if you made it conditional that those schools abide by that set of regulations.
Right. I think that's an accurate characterization of sort of what we know so far about these different programs.
Josh, you mentioned that vouchers and ESAs must be judged by the coin of the realm, which is standardized test scores. As an advocate for public schools, how do you feel about the status quo of test scores being the coin of the realm? And what other ways do you see for advocates and analysts to judge education policy outcomes?
Well, I'm going to answer that in the spirit of this conversation. I I have tried to, vouchers are a controversial enough thing without bringing in other controversies to weigh in on. I will say this. I believe that test-based accountability has done real things, really positive things, particularly for identifying where investments need to be made and identifying the size of opportunity gaps in certain communities. For example, I think it's helpful to know that in some of the highest scoring districts in the country, districts that we might associate, Ann Arbor down the road from me, for example, or Chapel Hill, North Carolina, or Berkeley, California, districts that we know there's a lot of sort of investment and high rates of education in general among the parent population. We also know that there are still extraordinary race-based and income-based gaps in those communities. And we know that partly because of the testing framework there. We know that folks are being left behind in some of those wealthiest communities. I think there's real value for test-based accountability when it's framed that way. Does that mean I think that test scores measure everything about a child? No. And I know there's a big, I think there's a vote of some sort, right, coming up in your area now on the using Massachusetts exam. Does that mean that test scores measure everything? No, they don't. And does that mean that too much education practice, teaching practice is targeted toward those test dates in public schools? Yes, that there seems to be real evidence that both teachers and administrators focus very heavily on tested subjects in those at that time of year. But I would say this just. We are, as Paul keeps reminding us, we are talking about using taxpayer dollars. We are talking about making investments. And if we're asking questions about economic efficiency in a way that's also geared toward making sure we ask questions about economic efficiency when it comes to education, we're also asking questions about economic equality, economic equity when it comes to education, then I think there is a place to use these testing instruments for it. But if it's simply a conversation about which schools are producing more, as if every child was a widget, which schools are producing higher scores, and then I think that's a misuse of these things. And so I think we do need to try to have a balance that really is focused again on equity and opportunity.
So if the schools can pick their students via lotteries or selection, doesn't that skew the data?
So the rigorous studies on the charter school or the voucher side or other education interventions would often use the lottery as a way to essentially apply what has been called the gold standard of education inquiry, which just means some kids lose the lottery and you have a general ability to kind of compare who wanted to go but couldn't versus who wanted to go and could, and that has given some evidence that I talked about today. That's not the only way to evaluate these things, as long as you're able to kind of over time map out. And one of the strongest critiques I have of pro-voucher researchers is they'll discard incredibly rigorously collected data from places like Indiana or Ohio that have shown horrific academic loss for kids using those programs, but aren't coming from a randomized setting. What they are coming for is tracking kids' academic trajectories over time when they leave public schools to go to private schools. There are ways that you can recover the benefits of an experimental framework in that way. I will say, though, that the limitations around all of this are real and present when asking about those higher income children or the kids who have always been in private school. We're really never gonna, or at least I should say, there's not yet been a social science technique invented that would allow us to meaningfully track the progress of kids who've always used vouchers and sort of say those kids are somehow outperforming or underperforming kids in public schools. You really do need to know about changes that happen in a kid's educational environment to get a real good sense of what happens to them. And again, on that basis anyway, we know it's not good news for those kids.
Right. So what are some of the most effective grassroots opposition campaigns to vouchers that you've seen, either overall prevention or staying pilot programs? And what did those campaigns focus on?
Well, there's no sort of left-wing Betsy DeVos. I mean, there are progressive billionaires, but there's not like this massive advocacy coalition on that. There are, of course, teachers unions, and I talk about that in the book. And I've spoken to teachers unions groups myself. There are certain politicians and so on. But the way I would address this question is, it's voters and parents. So voters have never, not once, supported a state ballot initiative asking for vouchers, and vouchers are O for whatever. And when it comes to state ballot initiatives, now there are 3 on the ballot this November: Kentucky, Nebraska, and Colorado. So we'll see if that streak goes up. But when you just talk to actual parents and voters, they're very, very skeptical of voucher systems, which is why an enormous amount of money and effort goes into not calling the thing, calling vouchers, but calling them freedom accounts, hope accounts, things like that. So that's how I would answer that question. Is at the grassroots level, it's really actual voters have opposed to these things, and time after time again. And there's a reason for that. I mean, just understand that these are threats to their educational communities that they live in.
Right. So I think we have time for maybe just one more question. So how would you expand educational accountability beyond the test-based model that we use today?
Good question. So there are certain metrics. So graduation rates, of course, although there's some problems with that. I do think parent satisfaction needs to be brought into the conversation more than it has. I think that's one area that sort of conservative critics bring some value to this conversation. We do need to ask how parents are doing, particularly when it comes to servicing kids who have special academic needs. Like, I think it's pretty well documented that public schools from time to time, partly because they're under-resourced, don't always meet the every kid's need that they need to. I mean, it's of course a huge improvement over what the private schools are providing in the voucher space, but we need to take seriously the needs of diverse learners in public schools and make sure that those communities are well served by public schools. I raised this question a second ago. Opportunity gaps historically on the basis of race, income, now migrant status, English language learners, special needs. I mean, all of these things need to be asked about when it comes to public school outcomes, and asked not just on test scores or graduation rates, but other metrics. So just things like a school attendance, absentee rates. Are kids getting to school adequately every day? This is a strange thing to say, and I think some of my school administrator or principal friends would say, don't put us all on the hook for this without new funding. But we need to actually be asking questions about, do districts have the resources they need to make sure that they can turn their heating systems on in the winter? Can they turn their AC systems on in the summer when it gets hot before school gets out? Are the ventilation systems, we just got out of a pandemic, are the ventilation systems where they need to be for kids who might have asthma or, God forbid, another pandemic? I don't live that far from Flint, Michigan, where a generation of children were poisoned with lead in the water. Are our schools built the way they should be to make sure that kids are safe and they're physically? I think all of these questions, if not exactly accountability, do need to be asked about public school opportunity. And I hope that we can turn more of these conversations in the future to those questions.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you, everyone. It was a great conversation, and I know I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you all.
Good to be with you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Mia.